Her research focuses on economics of development, including areas of finance, health, urbanization, and gender. Dr. Ravi is also a visiting professor of economics at leading graduate business schools in India, including the BITS School of Management and the Indian School of Business. She was a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. Dr. Shamika Ravi publishes regularly in international peer-reviewed academic journals and translates her research for wider audiences through frequent op-eds in English and Hindi newspapers. Her research has been extensively featured and cited by global media outlets and national and regional newspapers across India. She is also a non-resident senior fellow of the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Ravi holds a PhD in economics from NYU, MA in economics from Delhi School of Economics, and BA honors in economics from Lady Shri Ram College for Women. Dr. Shamika Ravi will now speak on India's real economy.
Namaskar. Thank you for the opportunity. Very gracious of the organizers. This is a little bit from the sublime to the ridiculous. We've been talking passionately about the society and the community. We're going to switch to economy now. And I'm going to talk about the real economy. Now, what does real economy mean? And why do I say real? Well, it's vis-a-vis the financial sector. Because traditionally, macroeconomists deal with maybe 4 variables: GDP, fiscal deficit, inflation, right? And the real economy is much more than that. And so just tracking the Sensex or tracking the financial market is a very small subset of the real economy. So let's start by first looking at why India cannot afford to take the eyes off the growth ball. And while we have a lot of distraction, we are a robust democracy, a noisy democracy. We oppose all ideas, good or bad. But growth is not something we can put away or put on the back burner. And that is because all it takes is a generation. One generation back, I'm 46 years old and this is 45 years back, an average South Korean, an average Chinese, and an average Indian had the same quality of life. They had the same per capita income. And today, South Korea is 10 times richer than us. China is 4.5 times richer than us. So growth is not something that just happens. Growth is an outcome of policy interventions. We have to make growth happen. And growth is a real phenomenon, not an abstract concept. And that's why we have to study, and we cannot afford to take our eyes off. Now, besides just comparing with other economies, this is India's real growth. This is how our per capita income has increased. Now, one myth that needs busting is, when does the inflection point happen? Meaning, when do we really take off? It's not 1990. That's the first myth. And that's because, yes, rules were relaxed then. But for growth, you just don't need rules changing. You need active investment. And big-time investment and reforms into infrastructure, looking at telecom, energy sector, airlines, all of those happened under Vajpayee. That was NDA 1. So the inflection point there is the year 2000. That's when the economy truly took off and you went on to an exponential growth. But clearly, economy is not just about GDP, as I mentioned. We have to look at human development indicators. So what is human development indicators? What do they contain? Measures of health, measures of education, gender equality, and now, of course, it's getting richer. There, while economically we are around, 1/4 of China, or 25 years behind China, if you look at GDP, in terms of human development indicators, we are really just 10 years behind. And that is, I think, largely due to democracy. That when you make noise, public services become available, health becomes available, and that is the beauty of democracy. And I think we shouldn't forget that. This is getting to quality of life. These are, for those of you, though I doubt in this audience we will have people who buy that narrative, but that is a myth, that India is getting more intolerant. That is a larger narrative which is getting built. By the way, the talk today is really meant to bust a lot of those narrative, because you have to counter narrative with research and knowledge. These are the number of riots in the country. The number of riots were more than 1 lakh. We used to have more than 1 lakh riots a year in the late 80s. Today we have half that number. And you can see there's a structural break in the early 90s. So the country, if you just measure, and by the way, a riot is a very well-measured episode. It's a violent episode with more than 5 people aiming towards a common goal. That's the definition of riot, okay? This is crime against women. These are incidents of rape. Do you all see, first one is India, the rest are states of India. Barring Haryana, Jharkhand, and Rajasthan, every state has a structural break around 14, 15. Do you see that? Do you see the curve bending? That's a structural break. The number of rapes are coming down. Again, definitionally, you can't change the definition of rape. It is very well defined. This is in terms of connectivity in the country. You have more than 95% households in every district of the country today that have Aadhaar, Jan Dhan account or a bank account, and mobile phone. I cannot underscore what a tectonic shift this is to the country. Because not only is this the fundamental architecture on which the welfare state is getting mounted, so our welfare schemes are definitely getting more efficient, but this is also the architecture on which a lot of market solution, meaning businesses, are getting mounted. Now, the beauty of India's growth is while Jan Dhan and Aadhaar happened on the back of government enterprise and its government initiative, but mobile phone connectivity is almost entirely on the back of private enterprise. You can go to Nubra Valley, you go to Kutch, you go to Andamans, you go to Nagaland, you have phone connection and good phone connection. These are all trends that have happened in the last 8 or 9 years. So you have to understand structurally what is happening in the real economy of the country. This is the wealth distribution. This is another myth that India has a north-south divide. You know, every dot on this graph indicates 1,000 households. A green dot indicates 1,000 rich households. A yellow dot indicates 1,000 middle-class households. And a red dot indicates 1,000 poor households. This is a measure of wealth, meaning what are the assets that they actually own. It's not income, so it's not noisy. India does not have a north-south divide. But you can draw a line from Kanyakumari to Srinagar, and India has an east-west divide. Most of our affluence or the wealth is concentrated on the western part of the country. So now you understand movement of migrants back to the eastern sides. You understand why poverty is such a fundamental phenomenon concentrated on the eastern part of our country. But you must also therefore understand why in terms of policy and welfare, the eastern part of the country must take a greater dominance. This is our urban-rural divide. We do have an urban-rural divide. By the way, we have census which takes more than 10 years. Right now, the census hasn't even started. The real economy of India is at least a decade ahead of what the data is picking up. India is today at least 65% urban by various different metrics. The census tells us it is 37. Therefore, a lot of our policies have rural dominance. India is 65% at least urban. In fact, what you see are the green dots on the left panel. Those are your cities, because cities are the engines of growth and wealth creation. That is why we must focus increasingly on urban planning, on urbanization, city planning. And this was the last budget, was in fact the first where we actually announced a committee. This is what growth is about. Growth is about crashing infant mortality. Growth is not about Soot Boot Ki Sarkar. It's not about a handful of gainers. This is what growth gets you. This is GDP per capita on the x-axis. So what is happening with time? Your GDP per capita is increasing. Your infant mortality is crashing everywhere in the country. Not just in the southern states, not just in Odisha, Assam, Chhattisgarh, Haryana. It's happening in the poorest parts of the country. Those are the big populous states. That is what growth is about. Food security, we've come a very long way in terms of food security. We used to import 34% of our food requirements. Today, it's less than 4%. In fact, if you look at the food production index, we are more than self-sufficient. Today, it is about 112. So in terms of food security, we have come a long way, and it's important to understand that. However, the biggest challenge, and this is the context within which you must understand our Ukraine policy, you must try and understand why energy is such a critical and strategic concern. Our per capita consumption of energy increasing, yes, that's what growing economies will do. We are growing, and therefore we are using a lot of energy. But 34% of our energy consumed is imported. Compare that to other large economies. China, it is less than 9%, and China is 15%, US is less than 9%. Now, do you also see that the US has strategically brought down its dependence on imports when it comes to energy? That is what Europe is trying to do today against the Russian threat. But energy is one of our biggest challenges. This is overall the relationship between economic growth on the y-axis and health indicators on the x-axis. Do you see it's a positive trend? We are growing with development. So the narrative that we have growth, which is only for some, again, not true. Some states stand out. So in the right-hand side, you have states which are doing a very good job of growing economically and improving health indicators. What are those states? The two best, Gujarat and where you're sitting today. Well, this is a union territory. I have to be correct there. Tamil Nadu. These are states that have more than doubled their per capita income and less than halved their neonatal mortality. So this is excellent balance. Not all states are doing that. We do have problems. For instance, Punjab and Assam, they are doing very well when it comes to improving health, but in terms of growth, they are quite bad. And diametrically opposite, you have Haryana, where the growth is happening, but the health is still a tension. So again, not all states are moving in the same way, but by and large, it looks cool. Our states are growing at very different rates, and that will become a problem in some time. That is Goa and Delhi right on top. In fact, the difference between Delhi, Goa, and Bihar is the same as the difference between an average Indian and a South Korean, 10-folds. Bihar is our poorest state. But what you see here, in fact, the big takeaway is not only that there are some breakout states, they have gone way beyond the national average. Gujarat, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, these are states, Telangana, they are growing much faster. But the beauty here, in fact, what you have to focus on is Punjab. Punjab used to be our richest state. Today, the per capita income of Punjab is the same as Nagaland. And we still don't know what the growth model of Nagaland is, because 10% of Nagaland families have government jobs. That is not the source of growth. Okay, so Punjab is a sector, an economy where we are stagnating or losing out. Now, this is because you are hearing the narrative of unemployment and jobs, and there is a certain element of truth to it. India is a very large economy, so you don't think of India's labor market as one big labor market. You have 29 vibrant labor markets. But there is something very idiosyncratic, meaning very peculiar about India's labor market. We have one of the lowest labor force participation rate. China, what is labor force participation rate? People of the working age who are either working or looking for work. Well, that makes sense, from the age group of 18 to 60. Chinese have had labor force participation rate of more than 70% for last 30 years. Vietnam, it is 75%. Bangladesh is close to 60%. Our labor force participation is barely 50%, meaning half our population is neither working nor looking for work. And that is an enigma. We have to solve that enigma. But if now you look at the unemployment, meaning you're looking for work and not finding, so they are very different concepts, look across the states. The states that are growing, Gujarat, Karnataka, Chhattisgarh, they have very low unemployment rate. All India average is 7, these states have like barely 1. But look at Kerala, it's twice the national average. It's almost 13%. So states that are creating wealth are also creating jobs. So you have to look at state policies and the state economies to understand job creation. All I'm trying to tell you is this narrative at the all India level is very misleading. You have to get down to the state levels. But there is something peculiar about our youth. This is the unemployment rate of the youth, that's the red segment, versus people above the age of 30. Look at the difference in the unemployment rate. I know you can't see the exact, but just compare the red and the gray. The youth are 5 times more unemployed than people above the age of 30. That is weird, but it's a global phenomenon. The IMF calls it youth inactivity. It's a euphemism. It sounds better, but eventually we are saying that the youth are not being productive. But clearly something happens at 30. The chances are your parents are saying, "Bas, you have to get out now and do something." Right? So there is, and why do I say that? Because we have a phenomenon which is very peculiar and idiosyncratic, therefore, to India and some parts of China, which is called graduate unemployment. This graph tells you, for all the youth, so now you don't have old people in this graph, all youth, meaning under 30, people who have primary education and below, they are the gray guys, and people who have graduate degree and above are the red guys. This is the unemployment rate. So graduates are 6 times more unemployed than illiterate or people who have very little education. That is a problem. Why? Because traditionally, we grew up being told, "Bhai, padhai karo, you'll get a job, or you'll do well in life," right? Education is meant to give you a job and give you good quality of life. That is clearly not the case anymore. What is happening? There is a divergence between the degree that you hold and the skill that the market is willing to pay for. Because simultaneously, along with these surveys, almost all industry surveys are telling us, industry says capital is not the constraint to growth in India right now. It's skilled manpower. We just don't get good people. Now, how do these two things go together? It's the divergence between skill and degree. The second is quality of the education itself. That in many ways, the Skill India movement is meant to bridge that gap, but Skill India is also making up for bad quality school education. So we're putting a Band-Aid on a long-term fundamental problem with school education. So we have to get back to quality. Third, and not often well understood, manage expectations. Once you have a degree, you want an appropriate job. Now perhaps you don't deserve one, number one. Number two, that job is not coming because you don't have the skill that the market wants. So managing expectation, and this is where the role of leadership, so there is role for community and role for families. And therefore you must also appreciate why Startup India, why we want to encourage people to start self-employment or doing things, become entrepreneurial. We as a community have to get used to youngsters failing. So the pressure of trying new things comes down. Right? There is a huge pressure against trying anything new. And this is where I'll finally stop because I do want to take some questions because there are lots of people from the media and I want you to understand this graph very well. There is an area of economics called narrative economics. It started out of corporate finance because what companies do is that they plant stories about themselves or about their rivals and it affects the stock value or the share price. This is a well understood phenomenon. Today, we are seeing narrative economics take hold of policies at country levels. Countries are managing narratives. And this takes me back to the old saying, and I bet all of you are familiar with, that the universe is not made of atoms. The universe is made of stories. And those who control the stories are therefore going to control the universe. And so this is to the people who work in media or who are interested in these set of things. The beginning of this graph is the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. And what do you measure in this graph? It's a measure which natural language processing allows you to do, which is called media tone. You can string together words in a phrase, and you can assign a value to it saying, is it positive news or is it negative news? So natural language allows you to do this. In the beginning of the pandemic, almost all these 4 countries, they all have negative coverage. And then we say, chalo, all is well with the world because that's the job of media. Media is meant to highlight problems. But what happens since the pandemic? Look at the coverage in the global, and this is global media, mind you. So this is more than 100 languages across the world. So this has Bolivian media, this has Ghanaian media, this has Sri Lankan media, Chinese media, American media, Indian media, all global media. Look at the coverage that democracies of the world are getting. Those bottom four are India, US, and the reason you want to compare India and US as large federal democracies, there's always something happening. That big blip in the blue line is the US elections, that is Donald Trump. A lot of negative coverage. But you also have countries like Sweden and Germany there, smaller countries and homogeneous country, relatively. Not as noisy, many would say progressive democracies. They're all getting consistently negative coverage. What happens to the coverage of China? That's the red graph on top. China is actually getting positive coverage consistently, and you see the gap? The gap is only widening. This is the power of narratives. This is something we have to understand, because this is not benign. This is not just some random trend which we are plotting. This is an outcome of policy. This impacts investment decision. So when you say India is intolerant, or 50 lakh deaths in India, and you have very little, in fact, the only coverage you have of China is just how well they clamp down on citizens so that the virus wouldn't spread. You have to begin to take this into consideration when you read a story today. You also have to appreciate that when you're sitting at a negotiation table in a multilateral institution or at a forum, when human rights are on the table for negotiations, you are fighting this to a large extent. I'm not trying to tell you that discount human rights, but this is what you have to struggle against when you're striking a deal, whether it's a trade deal, it's an investment deal, or it's just what you feel about your country. So narratives are at the base of a lot of coverage in the media on countries today. And I think it's very important for us to not take things when they're just laid out the way they are. I think a critical thinking is necessary, but I think beyond critical thinking, we have to follow the money. Because now the news coming out is that Chinese government is buying media house, one media house at a time, one country at a time. And you buy influence in different ways. So again, this also puts the whole rule-based global order on its back foot, because this is what you're negotiating against. And I think it's important to understand this is the reality. This is what is happening. So nothing is benign, nothing is just randomly out there. It's an outcome of policy. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take some questions. Can I just ask, or will someone moderate? Definitely because of that, but perhaps not only because of that.
Hello, ma'am. Yeah. Hello, ma'am.
Yes, hi.
Yeah. So my first question is about the deficit of states and how they are able to manage their per capita income to be doubled, but they have a lot of deficit, like in the case of Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
And the other question is, when we talk about tier 1, 2, 3 cities, the investment, I mean, we should go where the money from where the money is coming.
Yeah.
So why don't we focus on developing tier 2 and tier 2 and tier 3 cities so that the development is democratized? Thank you.
You see, development is democratized by governments. Markets don't democratize development. Markets will go where there is greatest value for the shareholders. And that is why, but you know the greatest returns, you know the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid? You know what is the repayment rate of microfinance loans? 98%. What is the best commercial global banks? 91, 92%. So yes, there is a business model in the smaller places. The returns, in fact, are higher. In fact, there is a reason why money comes into emerging markets, because the returns are higher. right? So some of that is already happening through the market. But your first question on fiscal deficit, it's a huge concern. And after the pandemic, it's an even bigger concern. In fact, some state economies, of course, we are never going to become Sri Lanka. That is just sensation, because our institutions are stronger. But some states do have very, very fragile fiscal situation. And I think we are taking the FRBM too lightly. There are laws which mandate responsible behavior, but right now it is being put aside. But despite that, I would disagree with the Supreme Court. I think we encroach on the role of the executive when we say that we want to curtail the concept of freebies, because it's a political decision. Right? After all, when we recapitalize banks, or you waive off farmer loan, it's a guns versus butter choice that a government has to make. How much can I afford to recapitalize banks because non-performing assets are very high? And you know who took the biggest loans and who defaulted. They were not poor farmers. So those are political decisions. And I think best solved through political solutions.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, the growth of India is not a linear. It's not smooth. The increase in per capita income is also accompanied by the increase in inequality among the people. So I want to ask, as per you, which sector deserves the most attention if we are to have more linear or more smooth, less chaotic growth?
Our growth is not chaotic. Growth is never linear, by the way. People who believe growth can be linear, that was USSR, and where is USSR today? China is managing some degree, but the problem is we really have very little data. There are huge rural-urban disparities in China. It's just that we don't know enough about it. So you can't have linear, balanced growth. What you can do is think in terms of strategic importance. So you know when we are talking about Atmanirbharta, it's about 50 years from now, we want to be strategically resilient in certain sectors. Food is definitely one, energy is the second, and the third has to be defense. But strategically, economic growth and job creation, IT is going to remain a sector that we have comparative advantage, and the next big thing is health. Health is going to do for us in the next 50 years what IT did in the last 35 years. Because global economy is aging. They're looking for human resources, younger people who can take care. They're also looking for IT solutions, etc. And no economy has managed to reduce its health expenditure. So every country is looking to cut costs in health. So they will move towards us. For us, it's a natural second big market. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm Lakshay from Auroville. I would like to know your opinion of nudge when it comes to education, gender, and healthcare. Thank you.
So nudge is very fashionable, right? We all want to nudge and get people to do things. I think nudge is also powerful. But let's not forget, sometimes it's like we look at peripheral and small tweaks so much because it's such a cool idea that we forget the fundamental economics 101, that perhaps it has to do with just costs and access. So you have not taken care of fundamental problems of access. So nudge will do peripheral changes. So for instance, you know, when Swachh Bharat happened and the toilets were built, and they said people are not using it, let's nudge them into using it. Yes, at the periphery, but you know, water access was a problem. To me, that is much more commonsensical. Thank you. All right.
Good evening, madam. India is supplying food grains to many countries. India has supplied vaccine to countries. But when it comes to the global indexes, we are shown in a very poor light. And who exactly does this rating?
That's such a great question to end this. You know, indices should always be looked at with a grain of salt. Indices. Now, why do I say that? We actually have a series of articles, journal articles. These are not newspaper articles. These are very hardcore, peer-reviewed, international journal articles, which compare different kinds of indices. And do you know what triggered our research agenda is a very famous paper that came out in 2006, which said that corruption is cultural, meaning it's in our blood. We are just culturally corrupt. And it was a cool paper at that point, everybody liked. But to those of us who like to get into the micro details, the coolness and the sexiness really doesn't appeal that much. Because first of all, it's almost offensive to Indians that you are culturally corrupt. That's not true. And you know why you say this? Because while 20 people will chase a bus, metro, there is a line. And it's not that people are different. The bus, you don't know when the next bus will come, so you run for it. Metro, you know exactly when the next metro is coming. It's about supply. People behave in a certain way because, and this is all part of what is called government effectiveness. And we say government because we're talking about public goods in particular. So the culture aspect, that index, it's called a Kaufman index, we used it and we published basically saying that what you're trying to explain through culture is in fact far better explained through government effectiveness. That when you have sufficient transport, public transport, when you have transparent and honest public services, when you have good governance, meaning people have access to banking, people have access to public utilities, corruption goes down. So you can use these indices to challenge these other indices, but I think a lot of what is coming out more recently in the garb of democracy, freedom, etc., I think a lot of them are very badly done research. I don't want to attribute motive. Motive can be anything. They're just very poor studies because they are based on hypothetical questions asked to experts. And experts are very questionable today. Your experts are different from my experts. So these are cliques, these are groups of people that talk to each other, and these are eventually becoming echo chambers. So a lot of those indices are not worth, they're just bad research. Let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. Namaskar.